All right. How's everyone doing? As an activist here in Baltimore, I've seen the best of the city and the worst of the city. Certainly, I'm not a native Baltimorean, and when I moved here in 2010, I was really astonished by everything from the architecture, to the food, to the climate, and to the people. But I've also seen the worst of our city. We know that population is declining in Baltimore ever since 1950. We also know that starting in 1950, that the manufacturing jobs in this city began a rapid decline. And between 1950 and the year 2000, over 100,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in Baltimore. Now, those are jobs that predominantly men could obtain and they were able to use in order to take care of their families. They were able to work these jobs at the docks, in factories, and to be able to support their families. But in spite of the multiple problems that you hear discussed, excuse me for the feedback, no one really ever discusses the root problem here in Baltimore. In DC, there's a big discussion right now about the budget deficit. But I submit to you that the main problem that we have in this nation and here in this city is an ethical deficit, a deficit of concern about the least of these. The injustice that I've witnessed here in Baltimore, it threatens to permanently lock out people from power and access and opportunity. We hand out millions of dollars to corporate developers while recreation centers close and we close down our fire stations. If you've seen The Wire, then you know that one of the main theses of the show, starting in season 1, was that a game is being played, and whatever happens where people have power at the top of the social hierarchy, it rolls down and it begins to affect the people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy, kind of similar to what we saw in the presentation before mine, right? That the people that live in Smaltimore, that the policies that they make and the decisions that they do, it filters down and it often negatively impacts those who live in the DMV, those who live in Upton, Druid Heights, East Baltimore, and communities like Middle East and Greenmount East. So these are some of the issues that we face. And I would love to be able to tell you that, we're only a few tweaks away from fixing the problem. If we only fix a couple of things, we'll be right there in terms of solving and getting to where we need to be. But I must say that the forces of injustice are winning. The counter-revolution is winning. And if we are to defeat the forces of plutocracy, racism, and unsustainable development, we must out-organize and outwork those who would like to perpetuate the status quo. I want to see a Baltimore where we address poverty. But what we should realize is that poverty has multiple manifestations. There's a book called Economics Unmasked, From Power and Greed to Compassion in the Common Good by Philip Smith and Manfred Max Neef. And in this book, they talk about how there are multiple forms of poverty. For instance, there's the poverty of subsistence, and we're very familiar with this form of poverty. It's insufficient income, lack of food, lack of shelter. But they also talk about the poverty of protection, which is due to bad health systems, violence, an arms race. They talk about the poverty of understanding, which is due to indoctrination as opposed to education. There's a poverty of participation, which is due to marginalization and discrimination of women, children, and minorities. And so with these multiple forms of poverty, perhaps the people that live in the DMV, people that live in the neighborhoods that I mentioned earlier, they're not the only ones that are poor. Perhaps we share in poverty. We're poor because we live in a city that basically sustains and upholds a social hierarchy where a few people at the top can make policies and decisions, can pass pilots and TIFs through city council, can make sure that millionaires and billionaires receive funds for projects that won't really affect and help the rest of the people in this city. We give away this money in the hope that they will create 8,000 jobs, 9,000 jobs, but there's no provision that says something will happen to the developer if they don't create those jobs. So we're giving away the store. We give preference and deference to corporate developers instead of realizing that all of us are potential developers. All of us, if we had the right policy, lower taxes even, could become those who are helping to rebuild the city. You know, there are statistics that say that there are 16,000 vacant properties in Baltimore, but if you actually go and look at the data, it's really more like 40,000 vacant properties here in this city. And that lets you know that the city, like Detroit, that the presenter mentioned earlier, is hollowing out. We're displacing our poor, pushing them out to outlying areas, gentrification, displacement. If you know anything about the East Side, Johns Hopkins formed a corporation called East Baltimore Development Incorporated that displaced over 700 African American families starting in the year 2000. But in the 1950s and 1960s, Johns Hopkins displaced over 800 African American families in a project called the Broadway Project. And so this history of displacing folks, it really helps explain, especially when you understand the history of segregation in this country, you really begin to understand how we create policies that concentrate poverty. And now, instead of trying to alleviate poverty, we're really only concerned about displacing poverty and not getting to the root of what's really going on. So I submit to you that it's not just folks who have low incomes who are poor. We all experience a poverty of protection, right? We're all exposed to violence, inordinate levels of violence. Of course, if you live in the DMV, you're more likely to be exposed to police brutality, violence from gangs, those things that lessen and lower the life chances and opportunity of people that live in those neighborhoods. And we know those people to be predominantly African American. But in spite of this negative news that I'm giving you, I want you to know that there is a hope that lies within us, a hope that is found in both everyday leaders and leaders and everyday people. If I look back in history, I read about a group called the Goon Squad, a group of African American leaders that came together in churches like these to change the history of segregation here in Baltimore. If you go back in history, you learn about a lady called Lucille Gorham on the East Side. She was a housing activist for fair housing, one of those who came in the aftermath of the Johns Hopkins displacement in the 50s and 60s. And she helped fight in the next wave of development for fair housing for residents in the city. I'm impressed by young people like the Leaders for a Beautiful Struggle, Davon Love and his crew that speak truth to power. I'm impressed by a young man named Dwayne Johnson who works with me in a program that OSI graciously funded called You're the Quarterback. And Dwayne Johnson is an African-American male. He's about 42 years old. He has 5 children, and he works to help others in the community. He works to make sure others are connected to jobs and health insurance. And even when things don't go his way, he's been locked up. Child support, he feels, is harassing him because he has ownership, or he's basically the custodian of his children, and they come after him, even though he's the one who has custody, and he still doesn't give up. He still doesn't give in, and I'm really impressed by that. And finally, I'm really impressed by everyday people like Donald Gresham, an East Side activist, one who was displaced by Hopkins and EBDI. And somehow this man has this amazing dignity, this amazing resolve to fight injustice. Even though it's 10 years later, he's still fighting a good fight. And so as I close, I want to remind you of the lyrics of my favorite group, Parliament Funkadelic. In their song, Flashlight, they said, everybody's got a little light under the sun. And I believe it's our job to help make sure that every light that is in Baltimore can shine a little brighter. Thank you.